So now we're going to look at these things from a Christian perspective. And as I said, we begin by not thinking about the idea of what it means to be a person, or maybe even not what it means to be human, but we begin by saying something about the Christian idea of God. So what is the first thing that we can say about God? Well, I'm almost embarrassed to say it because it's so blatantly simple but hugely important, so I'm going to say it anyway. First thing is that God is a person. God is not a force or an influence or just a higher power. God is a person. Having said that it was simple, we need to unpack this a little bit more and say a bit more about it. You see, the Bible absolutely represents God as a person. In Genesis 1:1, we are told that God creates. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God creates, and to do that creation, it involved a mind and a will. A few verses later in Genesis it says, "Then God blessed them and said to them, Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves in the earth." So it says God said to them, so he communicates. And that of course takes a mind, and it takes a mind with a purpose and a will, and he communicates that will. But what about emotion? We see all the basic elements of God's personhood coming together, mind, emotion and will, coming together just a few paragraphs later, where it says this: God said that human evil was out of control. People thought evil, imagined evil, evil from morning to night. God was sorry that he'd made the human race in the first place. It broke his heart. And God said, I'll get rid of my ruined creation. Make a clean sweep. People, animals, snakes, insects, birds, the works. I'm sorry I made them. This passage reveals that God has a mind and a will, but that he also feels emotion. The Lord, you see, saw wickedness, and what he saw was not just animals killing each other. What upset him was a recognition of a greater fall from grace when he saw human wickedness, and the text actually tells us that his heart was broken. Now, many people today have a very non-emotional view of God, but the view of God that we see in the Bible is of a person who feels things. He can be offended, he can be upset. God feels things, and because he feels things, he may even express anger, but he also, of course, expresses and exercises mercy and love. And he exercises compassion, and most importantly, love. So God has a mind, God has emotions, and God has a will. Therefore we know from this that God, in the Bible, is portrayed as a person. Therefore we know that God is a person. Throughout the Bible, God is also referred to personally all the time, always with pronouns like I, you, and him. God is never ever referred to as it anywhere in the Bible. Now I know that sounds incredibly simple, but this is also incredibly important for Christian. Important when you understand that 2/3 of the people on this planet do not believe in the Creator God. And even half of all people who would describe themselves as having a religious worldview and who say they would believe in God, they would not necessarily agree with the statement that God is a person. Now you may say that that's not that important today, because we are unlikely in the West to come face to face with things like idol worship, or an object that people claim to be God, unless we happen to stumble across an artifact in a museum. However, we are very likely to meet this view among followers of some of the New Age philosophies and some of the extremes of the environmental movement, which say that God is in everything and that everything is God. Most New Agers and some Buddhists say God is not independent or separate from nature, rather he exists in and is just part of nature. In their eyes, he's not the God of creation as portrayed in the Bible, he's just part of the created order. You see, the Bible teaches that God is a person and that God is not just in the world, that he is the one who made the world. And the fact that God is a person means that he has personality. So what are the implications of believing that God is not a person? If God is not a person and he's just a force, then of course that means we cannot have a true, real relationship with him in any sense of the word. No personal communication, no prayer, no one to rely on, no confidence, no one to put your confidence in, and no hope. But because God is a person, then anybody, anywhere can know him and communicate with him person to person. Christianity, you see, is first and foremost about a relationship with the personhood of God. If we just keep remembering God is a person and everyone is made in the image of God, then any rules and regulations about how we live our lives or how we look at these other issues in society, that if we come from the point that everyone is made in the image of God, then that underlying perspective will begin to inform your decisions in a way that in a sense they really take care of themselves. So firstly, God is a person, but God is also a spirit. Let's think about that for a moment. The second basic thing that can be said about God is that he is a spirit, and that makes things a little more interesting. So if God is a spirit, what does that mean and why is it important? Well, God is a spirit. In other words, God is physically invisible. And this is very important because it means that if God is a spirit, then he can be worshipped anywhere. Not just on one mountain or temple or another, not just on Mount Zion or on Mount Gerizim, as the first century Jews and Samaritans argued about, not even in any particular church building. This tells us that God can be worshipped anywhere. Some people try and treat God like he's an object, which can only be found in one place, or they attempt to give particular geographical locations heightened importance and suggest you need to go there in order to meet with him or to receive a particular blessing. Remember this fact: God is spirit, and because he is spirit, he can be worshipped and experienced anywhere. God can be met with and worshipped anywhere. God is not handcuffed to any place or any pulpit or even any church. God is spirit, which means we can relate to him everywhere. You can talk to God anywhere and everywhere about anything because he is a spirit. Okay, I have one more thing to say about God. We've talked about the fact that he's a person and he's a spirit, but one final thing that we can say about him is that he is eternal. God is eternal. Now I know this seems obvious again, but again this is important because the Bible tells us that God is eternal throughout. Moses, right back in the early days of the Pentateuch, said, "The eternal God is your refuge, and underneath are the everlasting arms." And then 2,000 years later, someone called the Apostle Paul wrote, "Now to the King eternal, immortal, invisible, to God alone who is wise, be honor and glory forever and ever." Now, did you know that there are two types of eternal beings? Does that surprise you when I say that? Well, let me explain. There is the created and the uncreated. So the word eternal throughout the Bible is used in two different senses. In the first sense, it's applied to something that has a beginning but no end. So that applies to you and to me. You see, for us to live in the eternal means we came into existence, and once we come into existence, it does not end. But we, of course, had a beginning. Did you have a birthday? Did you have a beginning day? Yes, of course you did. Yet when we die physically, the Bible teaches that we will live on forever spiritually. Do not forget the fact that the Bible teaches that all humanity will live forever after we physically die. We will all exist forever into eternity. The Bible teaches the only difference between people is the destination where they will spend that eternity. But there is another way, a different way the word eternal is used and thought of when it is applied to God, because God is eternal, but he had neither beginning nor end, and God is alone in that category. The psalmist, speaking of this, said, before the mountains were brought forth, or you ever had formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. God is without beginning or end. He has no limits or dimensions. He is present without past or future. He is life without birth or death. He is today without yesterday or tomorrow. Now let me tell you why this is important. If God is eternal, it means you can have a relationship with him that will also be eternal. Because God is eternal, our relationship with him cannot and will not ever be broken, not by him anyway. This stands in stark contrast to human relationships. God's relationships with us will never be broken in any circumstances. Although these things are simple, basic and foundational, they are deeply significant. God is an eternal spiritual person. God is a person, and because of that we can know him personally. Not just have knowledge about him, but know and get to know him personally. And since God is a person, it is only possible to know him personally. And since God is spirit, it is only possible to get to know him by growing spiritually. And since God is eternal, it is possible not only to know him now, but to know him better and better every day and forever. So when it comes to personhood, ultimately the question is not who are you, but whose are you? To whom do you belong? You are valuable to God. You are unique and a complete, complicated personality fashioned in the image of God for a particular purpose. Ultimately, the root of every human conflict that we see in the world today is our inability to see each other in that way and to recognize every other person's innate worth as someone who is made in the image of God, regardless of creed, color, gender, or any other criteria. Having lost sight of that intrinsic beauty of every human person, is it any wonder we have learned to treat each other in such disrespectful and even often hateful ways? What it means to be a person is to be created in the image of God. What it means to find meaning is to find your Creator and to find out why he created you, for what purpose you were made. So in general terms, the image of God is the one you are created in, but in particular terms it is in his personality that has been placed in you by his Holy Spirit that you get to know him. To me, the person of Jesus Christ is the coherent answer to who I am and who inspires me personally. He declares my potential, he defines what's wrong with me, and he draws me into a personal relationship with him. He takes me through the process of suffering, shows me the purity of Jesus himself in the way that he taught and he lived, and then in rising from the dead he taught me that time is merely a passing, temporary thing, and that we in our personhood are here for eternity. He is able to take us through the cross, past the empty tomb, into the very presence of God himself. I do not believe that there is any other worldview that will give you corresponding and coherent answers to the problem of life and identity and personhood with logic and consistency. He provides logical consistency with experiential relevance. He is the way, the truth, and the life, and no one can come to the Father except through him. He describes your heart. He provides for any faults that you might have. He helps you make sense of your suffering, and he puts meaning into history, which to me says all we need do to live a meaningful life is surrender to him, to love him, follow him, serve him, live for him, and take his message with you wherever